Well, it looks like I am live again. Let's check my volume levels. Looking good. Welcome back to PHIL 1024 Searching for Reality, Fanshawe College in the summer of 2020. Now, this is going to be my last live stream for you guys because the summer sessions, unless it's a compressed course, are always divided in two. Summer 1 and Summer Part 2. In Part 2, Dr. Ed Matthews will be taking over. He's a really fantastic professor, and you're in really good hands. So after your week break, Ed will be taking over. A couple small things as we wrap up this first half. I know it looks like there's a lot to do this week. Right? We have online quizzes, online midterms, first essays, but these have been open for a very long time. Don't focus on the due dates. Focus on how long I opened these up for you guys, just to make sure you have time to do it. The reason everything is due kind of the 18th is because the 19th is when I'm supposed to post the midterm grades. Now, midterm grades, as you probably already know, are just informational about your standing. You can be satisfactory, which means you're on track to pass, or unsatisfactory, which means by at the date of June 18th, were you on track to pass or not? That's the question. For many of you, you might be a little bit behind on your essays. You had some accommodations, for example. You sent me an email saying, hey, can I have it a couple of extra days? So you might see that U grade pop up in your midterm for your midterm standing, but don't even worry about it. As long as everything gets in, you'll be fine. So just make sure, right, all these are done. That's today. And your standing will be great as you move into the second part of the course. If you have any questions, as always, send me an email. I know several of you sent me an email about online quiz 2 because I think the scores weren't publishing automatically. I fixed that issue. It took me a little while to dig through the settings to figure out why, and I apologize for the time it took. All right, week 7. We are talking about Hobbes, Locke, Spinoza. Right, we're still reading Sophie's World. The chapters to read are, of course, in FOL, a little bit buried in the website there. So if you're not sure what to read, send me an email and I'll point you to where that reading list is. Or just go scroll back down to the first announcement. I think there's a direct link there. Hobbes and Locke are two thinkers often clustered together because they're very similar in several respects. They're both British empiricists. That is, they believe that observation is the primary source of knowledge and is actually foundational to knowledge over reason, and that there are no innate ideas, which are two very important points. And they are also proponents of the social contract theory, which is not just a moral theory, but a theory in political science and political philosophy about the foundation and legitimacy of the state. And Spinoza, however, is a completely different kettle of fish, as we're going to see. Now, this week's content has 54 slides. I can't really go over it all in much detail. I'm going to try and keep it shorter. I know that these hour-long videos can be a lot. So, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke. What is social contract theory? We've already talked a little bit about what is empiricism, right? Descartes last week was a rationalist. Reason is the foundation of knowledge. The empiricist, as we know, observation is the basis, the foundation of knowledge. So these British empiricists were also social contract theorists. Now there's a link between your empiricism and your social contract theory. I hope that'll become a little bit more clear as we discuss social contract theory. But what is social contract theory? Well, the basic idea for these thinkers, who, as you see, were active, right, 1588, 1679, 1632, 1704, so we have like a very kind of early modern period just coming out of the Renaissance. Well, the idea is that we need to figure out a secular justification for the emerging secular nation state. And I say emerging because, of course, it would take several hundred years for the idea of church-state separation to really come to the fore. And of course, in some places that's still a work in progress. But the idea they had to argue against was this notion of the divine right of kings, which really tied together church authority with government authority. In fact, John Locke wrote the two treatises of government. The two treatises means there's two books inside his book, Treatise 1, the treatise number 1, treatise number 2. Treatise number 1 is not the one we focus on often because it's just a long argument against the divine right of kings. You might think it's 2020. The idea of having government by divine right seems very foreign to us, very alien, I would say, almost. But a few hundred years ago, it was the political philosophy you had to argue against before you could put your own ideas in the field. But of course, tying religion to government is not the greatest idea. Every now and again, somebody gets the bright idea that we should try it out again, but obviously the historical record for this idea is not that great. After the Protestant Reformation, right, this is a Wikipedia link to the article European Wars of Religion, because after the schism within Christianity between Protestants and Catholics, what you have is centuries and centuries of religious warfare. So the idea of a secular foundation is not to be irreligious, but to allow for people to have freedom of religion, because you're separating out government authority from ecclesiastical or church authority. Now, how do you come up with a new basis for government if it's not going to be divine right, if it's not going to be on the basis of the authority and legitimacy of the church and therefore of God himself, itself, herself? Well, you have this idea of a social contract. Now, the social contract is kind of, well, you take contract more or less literally. Nobody signs it when they're born. But the idea is that rationally we should all agree to be governed. And we just get together, we agree on the terms of our arrangement, because it is all in our interests to have a government. I think I have a copy of the two treatises of government on my bookshelf here. I don't have a copy of Hobbes' Leviathan. Probably showed my ripped jeans on the stream. But yeah, here's Locke's two treatises of government. As you see, a very thick book. But book 1. Where's book 1? Yeah, the first treatise is entitled, let me just find it very quickly. So here's the original, pretty cool looking front piece here. Pretty cool looking front piece. Let me just make sure you can see it. Let me read it to you. It says, look. It says, look. Hey, look. Two treatises of government. In the former, the false principles and foundation of Sir Robert Filmer and his followers are detected and overthrown. The false principles are detected and overthrown. So who's Sir Robert Filmer? Just the main divine right of king theorists. And in the second one, I closed it by accident, and in the second treatise, of course, we have, what's it called? The latter is an essay concerning the true, original extent and end of civil government. So that's what we're doing here when we're talking about John Locke and Thomas Hobbes. So let's start with Hobbes. Because both are social contract theorists that are pretty similar in some respects, but they have kind of a different end result. They have a different conception of what the terms of the social contract should be. Hobbes believed in strong government, centralized government, wielding absolute power. The reason you have a strong central government wielding absolute power is because people are inherently selfish, and you need to hold them in line. Otherwise, society will just break down. Hobbes was almost nihilistic, I would say, about the possibility of human morality. He just thinks people are bad. Well, and I have a quote here basically showing that I'm simplifying a little bit too much. He says, man is by nature more individualistic than social. Locke kind of flips this and says, no, the social contract arises just because we have to make a common cause, but we are more social than individualistic. So Locke is more of an optimist about human nature. He thinks people generally get along, and we're only going to need government in a limited way to coordinate projects like building roads, enforcing contracts through a court system, that sort of thing, where we need to act collectively. but left to our own devices, we're pretty good people. Hobbes disagrees. He says humans are kind of inherently selfish, and left to our own devices, we're bad. So, oh, here's the front piece of the Leviathan. All right, and if you kind of look closely, you'll see that the sovereign is actually composed of a multitude of people. Talked about this. So the social contract is the idea that everybody kind of signs into an agreement about the way civil society will be formed. And the reason it's legitimate, they're going to argue, has to do with the idea of the pre-political state of humans, humanity prior to civil society, something they're going to call the state of nature. Now, the state of nature, right, again, is this pre-political hypothetical condition of humanity prior to organized society. Now, I have to put a big asterisk on this idea because, of course, the state of nature never really existed. It's a purely hypothetical idea. But for both Hobbes and Locke, and also Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who we're not talking about, but other social contract theorists talk about the state of nature, these ideas are 100% influenced by European misunderstandings of civilizations they've come into contact with as a result of the age of exploration / the age of colonization. There is no pre-political state of humans because humans just organize themselves in political ways, whether or not we conceive of it in the way we do. Just because you don't need to have a giant parliament building to have political organization. The cities of what we call pre-Columbian, which is of pre-1492 Central America, were extremely well organized political entities. Okay, asterisk over. The idea is that there's this hypothetical state of nature, which is humanity prior to civil society, prior to the rule of law. Now, for Hobbes, he says, imagine a society without government, hypothetically. We would want to agree to a government, and this forms the basis of the social contract. Why would we want to agree to government if there were no government? Well, for Hobbes, the state of nature should be taken pretty literally. Without the rule of law, that is, without a ruler capable of enforcing law, humans, he says, exist in a state of warfare, and that warfare is all against all. In other words, everyone is attacking everyone because there's no rule of law to restrain them. We live in a state of continual fear and danger of violent death. The life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So, in the state of nature as Hobbes conceptualizes it, the state of nature is not just people living in pre-government societies or quote-unquote primitive societies, the way you might imagine your kind of like, Amazonian tribe or something like that, which again is in fact a politically organized society. But Hobbes is conceptualizing of the state of nature as nature. Right, so we have a couple hyenas here. Right, in the state of nature, every living creature struggles for its self-preservation, and there's a sense in which every animal has an equal right to do anything to this end of self-preservation. So this basic law of behavior in the state of nature is man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life. And when everyone has an equal right to do anything to survive in the state of nature, what that means is that the hyena, right, that has successfully killed its prey has not done anything wrong. Because that's just the way nature is. That's what nature does. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Now, if I'm hungry in our society and I kill an animal, there are rules about how and whether or not I'm able to do that. Right? I might need a hunting license. I can't kill someone's pet. Right? Because I don't have an equal right to do anything that everyone has. And if the gazelle killed the hyena in self-defense, the hyena can't say that's unfair because everyone has an equal right to survive in the state of nature. So For Hobbes, without government authority to create law, to create morality itself, humans are in the state of nature, which is the same conditions that wild animals are in. For Hobbes, the only difference between humans and animals is our rational nature. This means that Hobbes doesn't really believe there is a Platonic conception of justice, and by that I mean like a mind-independent conception of morality that we are bound to. For Hobbes, there are no rights. For Hobbes, there's no right, and I mean like there's no such thing as human rights. That's not a thing, right? There is no objective sense of the good that is mind-independent and is universal, and that we should use our, that we should use philosophy to discover. It doesn't exist. And there's certainly not, and in fact, he was called an atheist in his time. He says there's certainly not a sense of morality you can get through religion either. Humans are part of nature, and the only difference is that we're rational. We're able to use our reason, unlike animals. And therefore, we should invent morality. We should conceive of the invention of morality and politics as a technology to aid our survival. Not that much different from the spear, from the wheel, from the printing press. Morality is technology to aid the survival of humankind. And if we could create this technology, we find that the state of nature can be escaped. Right? It's not that it's good to be good. It is rational to invent the good as technology, which for Hobbes is to create law, submit to law, create authority, submit to authority. There's a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that kind of explains this idea. In fact, Hobbes, if you're familiar with this comic strip that ran back in the 80s and 90s, Hobbes is actually named, the tiger here, Hobbes, this is Calvin, Hobbes is actually named after Thomas Hobbes, the political philosopher we're studying right now. Calvin, who's named after the theologian, says, Hobbes, it seems the only time most people go outside is to walk to their cars. We have houses, electricity, plumbing, heat. Maybe we're so sheltered and comfortable that we've lost touch with the natural world, forgotten our place in it. We've lost our awe of nature. Which is why I want to ask you, a tiger, a wild animal close to nature, what you think we're put on earth to do. What's our purpose in life? Why are we here? We're here to devour each other alive. Oh yeah, turn on the lights, turn up the heat. So Hobbes here represents the idea of the state of nature. In nature, we're here to devour each other alive. Which is why Calvin goes back home and turns up the social contract in the form of lights and heat. So it's pretty good basic kind of explanation of what Hobbes is on about. How am I doing for time here? I've been live for 26 minutes already. This is, every week I tell myself, don't take an hour. So, here's just a quote from Leviathan. We do not accuse man's nature. The desires and passions of man are in themselves no sin, no more the actions that proceed from those passions, till they know a law that forbids them. Which till laws can be made they cannot know, nor can they agree on any law be made, till they agreed upon the person that shall make it. To this war of every man against every man, nothing can be unjust. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice have no place. They are qualities that relate to men in society, not in solitude. So again, for Hobbes, there is no justice, there's no morality, there's no right and wrong prior to the invention of these categories. Now, the fact that they're invented doesn't mean they're false, doesn't mean they're relative, doesn't mean they can be ignored. In fact, quite the contrary. It's precisely because we invent them that they're robust. However, in the state of nature, you cannot accuse the predator of being unjust. You cannot accuse the prey of running too fast. Because the notion of right and wrong has to be created. And you create it by empowering a sovereign authority. Because as Hobbes says, it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they're in that condition which is called war. So what we need is a common power to keep everyone in line, which is not a democracy for Hobbes, but a form of absolute of tyranny, of absolute government power. The sovereign power, in fact, can't break the law by definition, because the sovereign power in the social contract is the law. So we need an all-powerful ruler for a number of reasons. One, it needs to be all-powerful in order to legitimize the idea of lawfulness itself. The sovereign power embodies the idea of law. And you also need it because people may still act wrongly for their self-interest. Well, all the other suckers follow the rules. And it is the fear of punishment by an all-powerful ruler that can prevent this. Anything weaker would not be able to deter bad action, to return to a regular state of nature, kind of instinctive, selfish actions. So the threat of the state replaces the threat of a punitive God. Because that's often one of the arguments that you'll get once you try to move to a secular form of authority and law. Right? Well, how do you know people will behave well when no one's watching? Under the theocratic conception of the state, where government is ultimately backed by a divine right, God is always watching. God is what ensures that even when you're by yourself, you do the right thing. So the state has to be powerful enough to serve as a deterrent to wrong action. And this is kind of where it ties in a way with his materialism and empiricism. Right? He assumes that materialism is true. That is, that we are all just atoms in the void, on the style of Democritus, Lucretius, the Epicureans. There are no objective moral facts. Morality, in fact, doesn't really exist. It's an invention. I keep calling it a technology for Hobbes. Life is matter in motion in a particular configuration. But where life is able to be rational, the technology of morality can be invented, which is the social contract, which leads us to empower a sovereign to create laws and to create the authority sufficient to deter law breaking. And in fact, it is precisely because humans are egotistical and selfish that our own fear of death can be used against us to motivate us to join the social contract. Again, another reason the sovereign power has to be absolute. The only thing, we are rational creatures that fear death. Therefore, it is the threat of death that will make sure that becomes the only rational thing to do is obey the law. And therefore, for Hobbes, the only peril we should fear that could overturn the state is human irrationality and a lack of fear of death. All right, there's some slides here. The prisoner's dilemma is a little complicated to explain, especially in a non-classroom environment, because it's kind of fun to actually play the prisoner's dilemma in the classroom. But this is just a video that maybe if people watch it, it might be like next week or something. So for the prisoner's dilemma, that's just an example of why you need enforcement to prevent self-interested bad behavior. Because it is in the rational self-interest of people in this situation here in the prisoner's dilemma to not cooperate. So how do you ensure cooperation? Well, basically you make non-cooperation, you change the outcome matrix of the game theory here, of the prisoner's dilemma game. So if you're interested in game theoretical approaches, kind of more mathematical approaches to rational behavior, you can click through on the link here. It's actually really interesting. So, as Hobbes says, we need to use the fear of death that everyone has in conjunction with their rationality to make them rationally fear breaking the law, to motivate them to act well. Otherwise, people will slide back into their state of nature behavior. So before the names of just and unjust can have place, there must be some coercive power to compel men to the performance of their covenants, their contracts, their agreements, by the terror of some punishment greater than the benefit they expect by the breach of their covenant. And so the fear of punishment must be greater than the benefit they expect. And to make good that propriety, which by mutual contract men acquired, in recompense of the universal right they abandon. So the universal right they abandon is the right everyone has to everything in the state of nature, which we have to kind of give up, right? Again, go back to Plato's Republic, where the sophist Thrasymachus just argues that there's no right or wrong. All there is power and the ability of powerful people to get away with what they can. And that's what we need to abandon. The idea that if I'm in a situation where I happen to have more power over someone else, I can do wrong by them. I can abandon my covenant. Or if I have an employee and I tell them they're not going to get paid this week, what are they going to do to me? Well, they have to go through like a court system or something like that, right? So my fear of getting punished has to be higher than the recompense. The recompense, in other words, the benefit I will get from not paying employees and keeping the money for myself, which is the point of the state. Fun fact, wage theft is the #1 form of theft in North America, greater than all other forms of theft combined. Look it up. Okay, so the Hobbesian social contract, we surrender our natural liberty and right of all things to a common centralized power, which has to be powerful enough to compel you via fear to behave, because that fear must always be greater than the benefit you get from breaking the rules. And the sovereign defines all legality and morality, embodies it, right? There are no natural rights outside of it, right? Sometimes you get some libertarian philosophers often argue on the basis of there's a natural right to property ownership, that there's a non-aggression principle that's prior to government, and morality has to be, you have to respect morality, you have to respect people's private property, you have to not initiate force or aggression. Hobbes rejects all that stuff. Property is a social construct. Right? Private property does not exist outside the state. That's probably rankling some people right now, going, "Oh, property! Oh, the state creates property." That sounds like communist collectivism. No, that's just all right. Good. Karl Marx wouldn't write a word for 200 years. Hobbes says it is the government which creates the idea of property ownership, can enforce property ownership, can keep maps, can settle disputes about where one person's property begins and the other one ends, and so on and so forth. Right? Without a sovereign, you can't have any of these things. Sovereign, yeah. So there's some other stuff. Democracy. So I don't agree with Hobbes. I think democracy does a better job of keeping the peace and keeping people honest than an absolute government. But you can kind of look at those slides where I kind of criticize a little bit, where we do a little bit of discussion. Okay, I am at, God, I got to be at 35 minutes by now. 35 minutes, 49 seconds. Good job, internal clock. So Locke is also a social contract theorist. He's also a very significant empiricist, in addition to being a social contract kind of liberal theorist. So the Two Treatises of Government, which is the book I have here, which, as you can tell, I didn't spend a lot of time reading in my my grad studies. I was interested in logic and metaphysics and language and political philosophy. Look how it's a long book. So the inquiry concerning human understanding has to do with epistemology, metaphysics, science, right, where he puts forth his understanding of empiricism. The Two Treatises, governance, political philosophy, social contract. Both books are really influential, particularly the Two Treatises of Government, because a lot of the ideas in Locke were kind of enshrined in the American Constitution. In terms of Locke's empiricism, just very briefly, empiricism, of course, is the view that observation is the foundational kind of way in which we acquire knowledge, as opposed to rationalism, which says that reason is first and it's reason that justifies the use of observation. But Locke says we gain all knowledge of the world from our senses. There are no innate ideas. He says, when we are born, we are blank slates, tabula rasa. We are not born with any ideas. Our senses give us simple ideas, simple percepts of color, of sound, and we use these to build complex ideas. And the complex ideas can then be combined to make like meta-complex ideas, meta-meta-complex ideas, and so on. Right? Which it allows us to understand why fictional ideas are possible. They're complexes of other ideas, right? Like horse plus something with a horn. Boom, you have unicorn, right? So what is the mind? It is a engine capable of mental combination of concepts. Basically, it's a computational theory of mind. The mind is kind of a computer. Of course, computers didn't exist, and Locke had no idea how mental combination worked. But I think he would have been really excited by the idea of the brain's a computer. Locke criticizes Descartes, basically the way Aristotle criticizes Plato, roughly. Gosh, my professors in university are like, no, that's not right. Look, this is an intro class. The ideas we reflect on cannot be innate. They must come from our senses. We cannot discuss what we have not experienced. Thus, Descartes does not have an innate idea of a perfect being. That's impossible. Right? You cannot have an innate idea of a perfect being, allowing you to use only your reason to justify sense observation. Your idea of a perfect being must have come from some observations, which created a complex idea on the basis of simples. So boom, it is observation that justifies the use of reason in the world and not the other way around. All right, I've already talked about this. So, of course, this led Locke to denying that we have an innate idea of God. Now, denying that there's an innate idea of God is actually pretty politically radical for the early modern period. A lot of theologians argued for something called the sensus divinatus, or related concepts that everyone has an innate conception of a monotheistic God, and if you claim to be an atheist, or you claim to have never heard of it, in a way you must be lying or deluded, because of course you would. Now, naturally, as people start exploring more, and by people I mean Europeans, as Europeans started exploring more and, encountering other forms of social organization, other forms of belief, and realizing that, wow, my gosh, not everyone's a monotheistic Christian in the world, you had to either say one of two things, that people who don't believe in God are innately wrong, or they're not wrong because they've never heard of it. And if people who've never heard of God, through no fault of their own, aren't going to hell, then the moral thing to do is to not tell them. Right? Because think about it this way. Say that, all right, if you say you've never heard of Christianity, either you're going to go to hell because you're not saved, or you're not. Now, it seems unfair to not go to hell because you've never heard of it. So as long as you've never heard of it, you're safe. The only thing hearing about Christianity can do is get you in trouble, because now you have a choice, and if you make the wrong one, you're going to go to hell. But if you never hear it, then you're absolutely safe. Therefore, missionary work is wrong. Now, this argument is really dangerous, right? So, of course, you have to argue for something like an innate conception of God. Locke denies it. He says we are tabula rasa, and in fact, he points to what we would think of as anthropological evidence of other people, saying, see, even distant people, right, don't have an idea of God, thus showing that there are no innate ideas. And if there are no innate ideas, then in particular, empiricism, this kind of like anti-rationalistic, anti-innate idea, empiricism, makes way for a secular state, because then we have a free play of concepts. We can reconfigure government as we see fit. We can create new concepts. We're not, in a way, bound by our innate ideas of God or right or wrong, because all ideas come from observation. So, Two Treatises of Government is a really kind of radical work in its context. So, as I said, Book 1 argues against the divine right of kings, and Book 2, democratic government is a social contract between equal individuals, including women. Good job, Locke. In the essay, he articulates separation of powers. What is illegitimate power? When illegitimate power could be deposed and replaced. I already talked about divine right of kings. Locke also talks about the state of nature, but the state of nature is not like Hobbes. Hobbes believed the state of nature was warlike and awful, basically the state wild animals find themselves in, hunting, devouring each other, dying senselessly with no recourse. However, Locke disagrees with Hobbes. Locke believes that human beings are mostly reasonable and tolerant. Left to our own devices, we will pursue our self-interest, but it's mostly benign self-interest, because we recognize other human beings as having equal right to liberty, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, basically. Now, why do we need government then if we're mostly reasonable and tolerant left to our own devices? Well, sometimes individual action is not sufficient to defend individual rights. Sometimes institutions can mediate conflict over scarce resources, and sometimes, of course, government can help us do things that we can't do alone, like build infrastructure. So, one of the big differences between Hobbes and Locke is where Hobbes is basically a materialistic nihilist who believes that morality is a technology that needs to be invented, that there are no rights, there's no such thing as like property rights or freedom of speech, there's no right to life in the state of nature. We have to pretend that all these things exist if the sovereign agrees. For Locke, humans have lots of natural rights. And these are in fact prior to society. There's a kind of a natural law. And this is a form of morality kind of inherent to human nature. Whoops, I thought you said there were no innate ideas. It's not an idea. It's something that just kind of exists as a function of the kind of creatures we are. This is how we behave. We're social creatures. So we can form social laws via common consent. Political power is the exercise of the social law created for the better preservation and extension of our natural rights. So I can consent to have some of my rights curtailed if I transgress the law, as long as everyone else does. So the idea is to form a government that benefits all to extend our natural rights. Thus, government power doesn't need to be absolute for Locke. We should construct it in the manner that best serves its purpose, which is extending our natural rights. So Locke argues for the idea of the separation of powers. Now, in the United States, we are familiar with the idea that there's legislative, executive, judicial branch. He doesn't mention the judicial. It's more legislative and executive. I don't mean to get too much in the weeds here. But roughly, right, Locke is going to argue for a state with limited separate powers, whereas Hobbes argues for unlimited centralized power. And a lot of this has to do with their conceptions of human nature. Right? Whereas Hobbes is pessimistic, Locke is optimistic about our ability to get along. Locke, I mean, again, some of this stuff is contextual to kind of the period 16th, 17th centuries. Locke will argue that unused property is a crime against all, which, so you mentioned there's these wealthy landowners in the UK that aren't cultivating their fields while people starve. He says that's a crime. He warns about inequality, and part of the function of government is to address inequality. So there's some stuff there in Locke which is pretty interesting. One of the interesting things as well about Locke is that he has a theory of property rights. Now, for Hobbes, private property is a creation of the government that can enforce it as it sees best fit. But roughly outside of the centralized authority of government, there can be no private property. Private property is a creation of the state. Locke disagrees. Locke thinks we have natural rights, including a natural right to property that is prior to government. How is this possible? Well, Locke says in the state of nature, you acquire your property by mixing your labor with the goods or the land. So even the state of nature, like if I gather some food, if I hunt food, I've mixed my labor with it, and therefore I own it. So I have a natural right to own the things I gathered or hunted. Hobbes would disagree, of course, right? So Hobbes in the state of nature says, what you should really be doing if you're smart is you wait for some other sucker to spend the whole day hunting, and when he's done cooking it, you smack him on the head and you eat it, right? That's a lot less effort. And you have a right to do that. right in scare quotes. Locke would say, no, that's wrong because the hunter mixed his labor with the thing he hunted. And if you want to own land, well, you have to cultivate and make use of it. You mix your labor with it. This led quite naturally to an argument, and Locke was involved in colonial era practices, including governance and land ownership and displacement of the people that already lived in North America. So if property is mixing your labor with the land, all you need to do is have a specific understanding of what labor is, so that the vast unspoiled wilderness of the New World could be rightly owned by European settlers who could cultivate it and actually use it. The land is not given by God so that it should always remain common and uncultivated. Right? But of course, the people that were already there on Turtle Island had mixed their labor with it. They were just taking care of it a different way. So, is John Locke a theorist of colonial empire? That's a really interesting question. I have a link to a paper you can read here. So his theory of labor were in fact often used in settler colonies by the theorists who promoted European settlement to justify the expropriation of indigenous peoples. Right. So, as important as Locke is to our civil society, to our forms of government, right, you should also place them in context here, that some of these theories were definitely used in a colonial context. I just wanted to acknowledge that here. Right, and of course, right, the this abstract mix your labor argument, in the abstract looks like it makes sense, maybe, if you kind of squint. But in practice, you have to ignore the facts on the ground, right? There were really sophisticated agricultural practices that have been developed, right? Like the Three Sisters planting method, right? So anyway, there's interesting issues to kind of sort out here as we begin to look at philosophers who are working in a period of rapid colonial expansion. In fact, I received an email from a student recently asking why the class seemed to focus mostly on a fairly small segment of philosophers, mostly coming from kind of a specific part of the world, right? We've looked mostly at philosophers that are coming from the Mediterranean basin, and then after that, Western Europe, right? So we're looking at, Greece, Turkey, North Africa, then, France, England, right? So, I mean, there's definitely kind of what we call Eurocentrism here. So I just wanted to definitely acknowledge that aspect of the course. Okay. Spinoza. God, I've been talking for almost an hour. I did it again. So Spinoza has nothing to do with social contract theory or empiricism. He's not a political philosopher, really, and he's not an empiricist at all. He's a rationalist. He was definitely a heretic in the sense that he wrote on matters he thought of as religious, but we might think of as philosophical. And Spinoza is often recognized later in history as a really quite important rationalistic philosopher. So he was in Holland, making a pretty modest living grinding and polishing lenses for telescopes. He eventually died because of the silicon, the glass dust he would inhale. And he wrote these books, which were pretty much banned and circulated illegally. But Holland was remarkably tolerant, and he didn't have to really worry about getting arrested for his views, which were a number of things. One, that religious texts should be approached critically as products of their time. We should kind of look up the history of when they were written, compare different sources, and just have kind of a critical approach to it. And second, and even more controversially, that we should not understand God or divinity as separate from creation, but actually identical to creation, which is a kind of pantheism. So God, in fact, is nature, is the universe. These views led him to be excommunicated from his synagogue. He was also attacked by people. So, I mean, the legend says that he was attacked by a knife-wielding assailant, but the blade only cut his cloak because he wore a thick cloak, and then he actually never fixed his cloak. He always wore it with a ragged kind of knife cut in it, just as a reminder to be careful out there. So the major work I'm just going to discuss very briefly is the Ethics, placed on the Index of Banned Books, the Index Liborum Prohibitorum. I love Latin, so easy to make things rhyme. Can you imagine if hip-hop had existed like during the Roman period? Because I think Latin would be such a great language to rap in. Oh my gosh. So let's go way back to Descartes. Descartes was a dualist, right? He believed that there was two separate kinds of substances. There's material substance and there's spiritual substance. Humans are a combination of both. But if we are both minds and bodies, how does mind and body interact? Whoops, we have a problem. Lots of different solutions. Spinoza's solution was to say, there are not different substances, there's only one kind of substance. Spinoza's monism, there's only one kind of substance, was not materialism, was not kind of like ancient atomism, Democritus, Lucretius, there's atoms in the void, not Hobbes also, another materialist. Spinoza argued that matter, body, mind, are just attributes of one fundamental substance. It's a way the substance can be. In fact, there were infinitely many possible attributes of the fundamental substance. The fundamental substance is God. But if there's one fundamental substance, then that also means that material reality, that is the entire universe, is God. It's just an expression of God. Therefore, pantheism. God is not separate from creation. God did not say, let there be light, and created a universe separate from God. God is identical with creation. Creation is just an attribute or a property of God's infinite nature. Pantheism, which is the identification of God with nature, with an impersonal nature, was viewed as kind of a form of atheism. Because God, in order to be a personal God you could have a relationship with, had to be separate from creation. At least that was the view at the time. This could really land you in serious trouble at the time. Now, how did he argue for this conclusion that there's one monistic substance, that substance is God, and that the natural universe which we see is just an expression of God's substance? Therefore, God and the universe are God. They're not exactly identical. All of the universe is in God, right? But the converse isn't necessarily true. He argued using a rationalistic method, deductive reasoning, to move from truth to truth. I think Spinoza was kind of better at it, though, but it also means he's a lot more tricky. So here's the logical structure of his opening arguments, right? So D's are definitions, right? Like the definition of substance, the definition of God, and these are axioms, and these are propositions. So like definition 3 leads to proposition 1, which leads to proposition 5. Right, so all these things kind of work together. Spinoza does proceed from the ontological argument, like many rationalists do at the time, because the ontological argument is a nice self-contained logical argument that allows you to be purely rationalistic, not depend on observation. And he'll begin from a set of definitions, axioms, and propositions that are self-evident in the sense that you can't deny them without leading to self-contradiction, to conclude there must exist one and only one infinite substance, what he calls God or nature, or Deus sive natura. So the details of this argument are pretty complex. Spinoza, you can look at it. Where's this page go? Yeah, this is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page. So if you're interested in this argument, that's the link you're going to want to follow if you have access to the slides from FOL. But it's pretty heavy stuff. Spinoza will deny that God exists separately from creation. Spinoza is also determinist, which means that in a way, everything that is going to happen has been predetermined from the moment of creation. And this includes God, since God is identical to the universe and to his creation. So God couldn't have acted otherwise, right? He doesn't believe in intercessory prayer. You can't pray to God and say, hey, can you change this thing? God's going to be like, nope, I set it all up already exactly as it should be. Right? In a way, intercessory prayer, that's just a fancy term for like asking for a miracle, to change something, is asking God to have created a different universe. And he did, but God could not have created a different universe. In fact, he could not have not created the universe. Right? A thing which has been determined by God to produce an effect cannot render itself undetermined. So God doesn't decide to create the universe for some purpose. It just logically had to be the way it is. Right? So you can kind of see the propositions here in the Ethics without Spinoza's commentary. A substance is prior in nature to its affections. What that means is, the substance, of course, is the basic stuff. And what it is, essentially, in and of itself, has to be prior, has to come before its affections, which is its other properties. One way to think about it is like if you think of an object, the extension, the shape of the object is prior to its color. That's one way to think about it. Two substances having different attributes have nothing in common. If things have nothing in common, one of them cannot be the cause of the other. In nature, there cannot be two or more substances of the same nature or attribute. One substance cannot be produced by another substance. It pertains to the nature of substance to exist. Every substance is infinite. The more reality each thing has, the more attributes belong to it. Each attribute of a substance must be conceived through itself. What Spinoza is trying to do here is saying, like, he's basically trying to reductio the idea that there are two substances. He says, look, if there are two substances, both of them have to be infinite. If they're both infinite, they'd overlap, they can't, right? That's impossible because they're both infinite. Therefore, there must only be one substance. All right, God, or a substance consisting of infinite attributes, each of which expresses eternal and infinite essence, necessarily exists. All right, so there's one substance. That substance is infinite. Therefore, that God substance necessarily exists. But God is identical with creation, is determined to act in advance, is impersonal, right, and could not be changed in any way. So, concludes Spinoza, whatever is in God or nature, and nothing could be or be conceived without God or nature. Right? And those who pretend that God is like man, consisting of a body and a mind, are subject to passions, right? Basically being irrational. They're being emotional about it. But how far they wander from true knowledge of God is sufficiently established by what has already been demonstrated. All right. Just in case you're lost about Spinoza. Okay, there's one substance. That substance has infinite kind of properties or attributes. We experience some of these properties as matter, as thought, which Descartes mistakenly thought of as two distinct substances. But of course, having two substances is impossible. We know this through our rationalistic argument, and we also know this because when Descartes tried to have two substances, we had all these problems about interaction, which just shows that dualism is not going to work. There's only one thing, and that's God. So Spinoza's rationalistic work, while very kind of geometric in the sense of the way it's structured, is also kind of mystical. Because if you think about it, everything is an expression of God's fundamental being, right? Everything, like the lint in your pocket, a handful of gravel, your firstborn, it's all God. Okay, there's this quote on the internet that goes like, look, what is hydrogen? Hydrogen is a colorless, odorless gas that, given long enough, thinks about itself. Right? Given enough time, hydrogen starts to wonder where it came from and where it's going. What does that mean? Well, look, at the time of creation, the universe was mostly hydrogen. It still is. Right? Our best models of the Big Bang, it says the matter created at the very beginning was not heavy or complex. It was not at the edge of the periodic table. It's mostly stuff at the very beginning of the periodic table. Mostly hydrogen, a little bit of helium, maybe some other stuff. Right? So where did all the other stuff, everything heavier than lithium on the periodic table, was created? When massive clouds of hydrogen collapsed under the weight of their own gravity and self-ignited as a result of the tremendous pressure turning into stars. Eventually, these stars exploded, right, into supernovas, and via the process of nucleosynthesis created other heavier elements of the periodic table, like carbon. Eventually, the nucleosynthesized elements formed planets. Some of these planets got wet. Some of these planets started, right, these kind of chemical chain reactions, autocatalytic reactions, RNA world. Life evolved, and here we are, a few billion years later, hydrogen, thinking, why am I alive? Spinoza would be like, it was all supposed to happen, right? Because Spinoza says we're continuous with nature, and nature is God. I'm a manifestation, I'm a mode of the attributes of the substance. Right? It seems I'm separated from God, but that's just an appearance. It's a confusing appearance. Yeah, I'm a fluctuation of matter governed by a deterministic physical law, no different than any other piece of cosmic dust. But that cosmic dust is no different from God itself. An inner cause, not an outer cause. All this is an expression of God's unchanging essential nature. So, this view was condemned in its time, but Spinoza's pantheism and later on panentheism is now a pretty routine part of some mainstream theology for some, not for Catholics, but for some groups. And it played a pretty significant role afterwards by providing a conception of God, a deistic or pantheistic God, that was philosophically consistent-ish, which wasn't too material or too supernatural, but, you know, an impersonal deterministic God that can't intervene is not super compatible with most interpretations of monotheistic religion. Still, for philosophers at the time, it seemed pretty good compromise. So, you can kind of read some of these other slides where I have quotes about Spinoza, but I've really I've been talking for much too long here. If you've managed to make it to the end of this video, an hour and 5 minutes, I know there's a lot of content this week. I'm just excited by Hobbes and Locke and Spinoza. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed these live streams over this semester. Otherwise, summer 2, Ed Matthews is going to show up, and he's probably going to make a lot more concise videos than I've been able to. All right, I'm signing off. Send me an email if there's anything at all I can do for you.